Hi, my name is Jeffrey Smith, and I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Responsible Technology, and I'm joined by two superheroes, Drs. Vandana Shiva and Bruce Lipton. We're here to talk about the corruption of science in the context of a recent retraction by the Journal of Food and Chemical Toxicology using unprecedented excuses to kick out a paper that indicted biotechnology and GMOs. We're talking about the Séralini paper. Here's the background. Monsanto does studies for 90 days on rats. And in those 90 days, they figured if they can feed 11% of their GM corn or soy, or 33% for just 90 days, and the animals don't get too sick, then it's okay to feed it to human beings for their entire lives. Now, Séralini happened to be evaluating the research on behalf of the European Union and France, and found that the animals were actually getting sick. There were signs of toxicity. And so he went public with his findings in a peer-reviewed research and was immediately challenged, etc., but the research held. So what he decided to do was to do another study extending the 90 days to 2 years, effectively the lifetime of the rats. And over that time, the rats, during the first 90 days, they looked fine. But in the next 30 days, they started to get tumors. And ultimately, they got multiple massive tumors. They had early death of 2 to 3 times the rate, and they had organ damage, the liver, the kidneys, and the pituitary. Now, what it showed was that it was not just the genetically engineered Roundup-ready corn, which is a corn sprayed with Roundup, but it was also the corn that hadn't been sprayed with Roundup that caused these same problems. It was also the Roundup without the corn that caused these same problems. Now, it was a surprise to Séralini and his team that there was multiple massive tumors. If they had known that, they would have used more rats and done a study for cancer. However, they did a toxicological study, and there was no protocol set up for how many rats and what type of testing. So what they simply did is they started with Monsanto's protocol. They used the same amount of rats in the control group that Monsanto did, the same type of rats, and they found multiple massive tumors, early death, and organ damage. When this was published on September 19th, 2012, it was like a shot heard round the world, but it was muzzled because the other side set up an effort to discredit the research, which suppressed the reporting. But it has been gaining traction. Now, what happened at the journal where it was published, Monsanto's man, Richard Goodman, was placed as the associate editor of biotechnology in the journal. And soon after, another paper which showed that the Bt toxin, which is normally found in Monsanto's Bt corn, caused damage to the red blood cells of mice. So, for some odd reason, for some coincidental reason, when a Monsanto scientist became the associate director of biotechnology for this paper, that was kicked out. It was immediately published somewhere else. Now, over a year after the publication, Séralini's paper has been retracted. And in the letter that the editor wrote, he said, this is not Monsanto's man, this is the main editor, he said, it is not based on fraud. It is not based on error. It is based on the fact that the evidence is not conclusive enough. Now, if you look at the science, how many papers that are published in peer-reviewed journals are conclusive? I'm leaving that open as a question so that one of you may be able to take this up. So this is the background. We have a Monsanto man moving into a peer-reviewed journal, and all of a sudden 2 studies that showed evidence of harm from Monsanto's products were kicked out. So I want to start with you, Vandana, in the context of the GMO debate. For someone who's never heard of the GMO debate, is unaware of how science is handled in that, can you place this particular incident?
The problem with the GMO debate is this, that at the time where science, both physical science through quantum theory, and I did my PhD on non-separability in quantum theory, the work that Bruce has done was showing that everything is interconnected at every level. And this idea of a fragmented, separated, mechanistic world is a very false idea. At that time, a paradigm was being put in place for genetic reductionism, of mechanistic models of the world as a machine, with genes as the building blocks. And it suited wonderfully, on the one hand, for political control, but more importantly, for what we saw as the emergence of the genetic engineering industry and the creation of this word, the GMO. So the very basis was based on a fraudulent science at a time we knew better, at a time where physics was realizing there's more to the world than mechanistic processes. That's the time where, in biology, a small element was starting to dominate and destroy the paradigm. They ruled, they got the Nobel Prizes, but you can't suppress science. And because the biosafety debate had started when we brought in Article 19.3 into the Convention on Biological Diversity, making it an obligation to assess the impacts of these new organisms created with genes that didn't belong to them, biosafety became a science, a new science appropriate to the release of genetically modified organisms. So in the US, they basically just said, we won't look, we won't see, we'll create substantial equivalence and we'll just be blind to all this. In Europe, there was more sincerity to look. So first we had Arpad Putzai, who actually was pro-GMO and was surprised to see the results that showed that the rats fed with GMO potatoes had shrunken brains, enlarged pancreas, immunity collapse. And he talked to his director. Together they held a press conference and all the pressure came on him. The kind of pressure that has come now on Séralini. In '98 already, Arpad Putzai, whose publications had been put into peer-reviewed journals, were made to look like here is a stupid person, a corrupt scientist, when he was the most respected lectin expert of the world, and the government of UK had picked him to do the study. But the crisis gets deeper. Séralini's case is, in a way, the last signal to us to say, if we don't wake up and we don't change things, there will be no knowledge. There will be no knowledge for scientists to practice authentic independent science, to really know on the one hand how the world works, but also when damage is caused, if there's harm, which we need to know if we've to live through safety, whether it's environmental safety or health safety. But even the ordinary citizen is impacted by this, and that's the important thing. This is not just about a Séralini. Why did this same structure and system have to undermine the right to know of ordinary citizens in California, in Washington? And the kind of studies they put out and said, oh, not only is GMO safe, but actually organic has no advantages. That paper had used a study of organic having no advantage, one-day feeding studies. One-day feeding studies. Now, those are conclusive evidence. And here's a thoroughly studied piece of research by someone who had served in government regulatory system and decided to go back to research, to generate the information for the larger public good. He didn't need to publish papers anymore. He'd gone way beyond that. But he felt a responsibility. And there's another level at which I call this knowledge terrorism, where you don't allow knowledge to thrive and knowledge to spread. It's the way the ordinary concern of the public is being damaged by not just shutting down the real science and the authentic science and the independent science and the free science, but by unleashing a false science on the public through public relations people, the Mark Linuses of the world. That too is knowledge terrorism, where they buy the media, they place these people speaking nonsense in prime spots on the media and really think the human brain is up for stealing, and it's up to us to not let it be stolen.
Beautiful, beautiful. Bruce, I want to ask you about this retraction and this control in the context of science in general. Now, the other side, the Monsanto side, got away with claiming that Séralini used the wrong strain of rats. And Monsanto published in the same journal their research with the same strain of rats. They also claimed that Séralini's control group was too small, and Monsanto analyzed the same number of rats in their control group, and somehow they got away with it. I mean, anyone looking at it from a reasonable perspective would say, is this really science? So Bruce, is this really science? Is this how it's practiced? What's going on?
For me, it's a total abomination of science for a very simple reason. this paper wasn't just put in by the authors. This paper was peer-reviewed. This means that other scientists, independent, have looked at this data and collectively have found that this was an acceptable data for a scientific paper. So when you're condemning the primary author, now you're condemning all the peer review people. Well, if this is going to happen, then this means there is no reliability for any science, because anyone can come up and say, well, I don't like the people who reviewed your paper, I want somebody else to do this. This would be a complete violation of the freedom of information in science that we do. Number two, being inconclusive, so to speak, very few science papers are totally conclusive when they come out. What is the function of publishing the paper? To introduce an idea, to introduce an observation into the world. This allows it, once it's introduced to the world, for other scientists to pick up this paper and see if they can duplicate this work and repeat and get the same findings or not. So if you take somebody's findings and throw them out because you don't want them to see them, you're not just throwing out the individual paper, you're interfering with scientists all over the world who would use this data in creating their own experiments. So once you start editing science to fit what you want, then by definition it's not science. Science is supposed to be open to the whole field. If they didn't like the data, they should repeat the exact same experiment and see if they get the same data or not. And if they don't get the same data, then they have an opportunity to publish a paper about that as well. But to remove someone else's work without even offering your contribution in that is, it's just an abomination to me, because no longer is science free to act and says, oh, if you publish what I like, then you can have a paper. And if you publish something different, then we won't publish the paper. Well, that's not science. That right now, that's a corporate takeover of the field of knowledge. That says, I have more money and I can buy your knowledge and I will not support your knowledge. That means we have closed our eyes, and therefore science is blind in this particular case. So it really gets at the root of the entire foundation of scientific research. All of science, really, in what we call primary journals, is really dependent on being reviewed by other people to see if this science really fits the category of a respectable paper for a publication. When we deny not just the author, but you now deny the other reviewers, then really what you're saying is, I have a very biased and jaundiced eye to see what I want to see, and these people didn't show it, so therefore I don't want to see it. And now I have to just simply say that means science has gone out the window at this point. Now it's just the best science that money can buy, perhaps, might be the way of putting it.
Thank you, Bruce. It's interesting. We're right now in Australia for the Uplift Fest. Vandana and I, earlier this year, were in China together with Dr. Séralini. And I asked him, I did an interview with him, and I asked him about some of the criticisms. And I just want to share one thing that's very interesting that most people don't think about. One of the criticisms, they said, of this paper is that the Sprague Dawley rats normally get cancer over their lifetime. And they were getting cancer up to 80% normally in the control groups in the public literature, in the peer-reviewed literature. In his research, the GMO-fed rats were getting up to 80%, but the controls had dramatically less. So when you compare in controlled conditions, those fed Roundup or the corn or the Roundup with the corn, the amount of tumors and early death and organ damage was significantly and statistically significantly greater than the controls. What Séralini pointed out was his control group had fewer damaging problems than the control groups used in other studies, because other studies use contaminated feed. You see, they use rat chow in rat studies and mice chow in mice studies, and they buy it from companies like Purina. And these companies, they use the regular genetically modified soy and corn that's been sprayed with Roundup, and so their controls are actually similar to Séralini's experimental group. And no one actually pays attention to that. In fact, if you look at the entire peer-reviewed research out of the United States since 1996, they're comparing some modality to GMO-fed animals, because virtually all the animals in the laboratory are fed GMOs sprayed with Roundup, and so it's skewing what we know to be healthy. That skewing is actually happening in the population in the United States. since GMOs were introduced in 1996, we see a dramatic increase correlated, or at least we can't say it's causal, but we have a lot of evidence suggesting it is, with gastrointestinal problems, with autism, with obesity, with diabetes, with certain types of cancer. And we can even see that the nature of the Roundup and the nature of the BT might predict these type of outcomes that are on the rise in the U.S. population, and as described by thousands of doctors who are prescribing non-GMO diets, and even more people who've gotten rid of GMOs, people are getting better from these same disorders and diseases. So the take home here is this. The Monsanto maybe won this little chess match in causing the retraction of the study, but they are in a desperate situation. There are millions of people in the United States who are avoiding GMOs. There are people all over the world who are rejecting it. We've already seen a tipping point of consumer rejection against GMOs following the Arpad-Pusztai affair in 1999. GMOs were kicked out of Europe by the food companies. In the United States, the food companies serving the natural food industry have kicked GMOs out or are in the process of doing so. We've seen a tipping point. We expect to see a tipping point in the rest of the food industry happening in the United States soon and spreading out around the world. So this is, I think, a desperate attempt from a failing technology.
Failed technology.
Yeah, a failed technology.
I don't think you said they won this round. They didn't win this round. They paid for this round. Okay.
They bought this round.
They bought this round, and what's really significant is the whole foundation of science. When you put a control group in, it's a control that says this is your standard, and then you compare against the standard. So even if I use rats from the same species in a different experiment, I still have to compare it to the control, no matter what experiment I'm working with. So you can't just, because the control group proved to be healthier, you still have to talk about, so why was the other one not healthier? You're still comparing against a standard. If you don't have a standard, then there is no research anymore. And so if you say, I don't like your standard, well, then all of a sudden all research goes out the window. But that has always been in every scientific assessment, is you need to compare it against the group that is not affected by your what you're testing. And when you find that group, and you say, well, okay, in my lab, these rats didn't get, the standard rats didn't get the tumors, but the experimental ones got the tumors, and they came from the same place and the same environment. You are not allowed to throw out the standard. Just because another laboratory has a different thing going on, that's what happens in their laboratory. So basically it says, you have to do the same thing. You have a standard, you have an experimental group. And if you get a difference, this is the whole foundation of science. We always have done that from the beginning. First you say, if this is normal, then you say, what is the consequence? And if it's not normal, that's the foundation of a paper. And you don't go back and say, I don't like your normal. That's completely an unscientific and a very slanderous position, in fact, at that.
And Jeffrey, just to wrap up, these are very highly technical issues of very complex studies, but there's other stuff which we can measure. Did GMOs produce more? No, they didn't. They keep repeating, this is a solution to hunger. The same fraud is being carried on at the broader level. It was supposed to reduce chemical use. Did it reduce chemical use? Everywhere chemical use has gone up. Now these are data available in the public domain, and this is not research that has to be carried out in a lab. So even in the public domain, they're countering the evidence of government statistics. So at every point, a failed technology is being upheld by this kind of manipulation of science and information of every kind, so that some of these companies who brought a lie to the world that GMOs are the answer to hunger, that for a few years more they'll make some money. But we will live through a history where, just like the church had to apologize to Galileo, these interests will have to apologize to the Séralinis and the Arpads.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's just staggering when you look at the rise of things like autism and the issues of disease and the health issues. It's not an epidemic. It's something happened that promoted this very quickly. A normal progression is a slow slope of change over time. Here we see they introduce something, and then radically right after, there's a very big change in the status of health. You can't attribute that to a natural cause, because the natural causes don't spike. They have a gradual increase. So what we're seeing is a spiking in disease and autism, and just a matter of ill health in a world that's being manipulated with chemistry.
And then the knowledge of the impact of that chemistry is being manipulated by the kind of retraction of the Séralini paper. So we have a dual hazard, the hazard to life and the hazard to our knowledge.
Beautiful. So, we'd like to thank you for joining us. We're here in Australia at the Uplift Fest, and we all give our support, as I think over 100 scientists just did, to Séralini, protesting against the retraction. In fact, the ripple effect is going around the world, and even though they bought this round, I think it's actually working against them, because the knowledge of the study in meetings like this and around the world is actually increasing as a result.
You can't retract knowledge.
There you go. And we'll end with that. You cannot retract knowledge. Safe eating.
Thank you.